basic thing.
Thank you.
Perfect. To just do the basic things that the Constitution asks in really the most administrative of ways, right? Um, and so now a lot of us know what should have happened, which many people didn't even know happened, let alone what should have happened, right? And then what did happen to me is something that had been long in the building, had been long in the building since before this president was inaugurated, and was the almost logical end to what had been building for 4 years. Now, at the same time, I like to say what I did not see. So, I did not see. So, one of my trainings is as a Latin Americanist. I study Latin American history. What I did not see was a serious attempt at being able to take over power. Um, it was an insurrection. It was a very badly performed coup attempt, but it was not really ever a serious threat to what will happen on January 20th. Unfortunately, it is a serious threat to individual lives, to individual people, to what we will encounter on a day to day reality outside of the Capitol building. In many ways, the people in the Capitol building, though they experience what terror and traumatizing realities have been experienced throughout the nation for a long time, they're going to be fine. They're going to be protected. They're going to have lots of security. What I'm more fearful of is what the same people who were emboldened to do that act yesterday will do once they come back home, once they see a gay couple walking down the street, or once they see any sign of what is wrong in their mind with this society and how they'll act on it. And I think that's the space that we're in now. So that distinction we need to make clear. What happened yesterday, as ugly as it was, as unprecedented as it was, as horrible as it was never a real threat to what will happen on January 20th, but it is a threat to people's lives on a day-to-day basis. And that's something that we need to deal with in a long-term reality. And I was really happy to see the team that Biden is going to put in the Department of Justice. I'll be honest; these are people that understand the problem, and we need people who are understanding of the problem to be able to start doing things that can deal with it. I think that's where I'm at right now.
Thanks, Chris. I appreciate it. I would also like to share that 4 people are confirmed dead from yesterday's event. And that I would just like to share on a personal level that I worked in Congress and I worked in Cannon House office building. People were evacuated, and I was there during 9/11 covering Homeland Security and was evacuated myself when I was adjacent. What I would say is that I was most surprised when we started that security didn't stop the masses from coming in, because every single day I went to work there, there is a mag and several guards at the doors to make sure you don't come in. I think it is worth noting that when Black Lives Matter protested, they were met by an army of armed people, and these people were not. And there is definite white privilege at play here that is very stark, in my opinion. I would also say that there are several the Capitol Police, and I lived 6 blocks behind the Capitol for a decade, so I'm very familiar with them, who were taking selfies with the protesters. I am sincerely hopeful that that they are fired at the, and not just impugned, but fired. I have been talking as recently as 15 minutes ago to my friends who still work on Capitol Hill. There's a whole underground system of tunnels and bomb shelters that are under the Capitol, and the staffers were rushed into those bomb shelters to remain safe yesterday, which was very traumatizing to my friends who were part of that, I can say. What happens next? That's the big question I'm sure a lot of people are asking themselves. I have some theories, but I would like to let Deepa speak a little bit. first too. Deepa?
Yeah. One of the things that I've been thinking about, in the aftermath of this is, so we live in a democracy, right? And I'm a person who spends a lot of time thinking about and reading about and studying and teaching about social movements. And yesterday's insurrection, right, is by some people being talked about as a movement, a spontaneous movement by the people, right? And if you have watched any of the videos that came out of it, some of the folks who stormed the Capitol, who got in, talked about what they were doing as a revolution, as some kind of revolutionary moment. And I think that erases how this uprising even started. This is nothing like what we saw over the summer, right? Where everyday people came together across races, across genders to protest police brutality, right? To protest the unjust taking of Black lives by police departments. This was an insurrection that was incited by a leader in power, right? Several blocks away, there was a leader, a president, a sitting president, who mobilized this mob and essentially gave them instructions on what to do. And this is not what the history of social movements in this country looks like, right? This is an authoritarian movement. This is a top-down movement. These people were doing the bidding of a person with power and in power who, like Cristobal says, is not worried deeply about what's going to happen to him after he loses power, right? The people that we need to be worrying about are the people who actually truly only have protest power at our hands to defend ourselves, right? And so I think we should be very careful when there are efforts to conflate what happened yesterday with the Black Lives Matter uprising that has been happening for the last year, with the civil rights movement, with other movements by marginalized groups to use the power of protest to claim rights, to claim basic equality, right? That's not what we saw yesterday.
Thank you, Deepa. I appreciate it. We're starting to get questions in. Please feel free to type in your questions in the chat and I will choose ones to answer. Someone asked why there wasn't more security more quickly in the district. I would like to explain that the District of Columbia is not a state and does not get the rights that state do. So they had already put a request in for the National Guard, but it has to be approved by Congress for it to go through. So it's a slower process than most states have. Within an hour or so of some of the destruction done to the Capitol, Virginia and Maryland sent their troops in where they are still staying. I can also report that the Department of Homeland Security and FBI have people who are protecting the Capitol today as well. So that's why we haven't heard of some of that.
Jill, if I could add
Yes,
one quick
yes.
thing on that, I think this is going to be an ongoing question and investigation point. Um, for me, and I didn't have the day-to-day experiences that Jill had at Washington, but I visited a few times. I've done research at the Library of Congress and the National Archives, right? Um, this would not ever be thought that could be possible.
Mhm.
Not that people are like, oh, there was bad planning or anything. No, the idea was that once you're in that space, you are under the belief that this could never happen in this space, just because of the level of security you as an individual had to go through. So for us to see what happened, and this now is my own personal opinion, I personally think somebody actually allowed it to happen. That's the only way I can envision this happening. Now, I want to see proof. I'm going to wait till I see evidence. I'm going to wait till all of that happens. But this is where my mind is at right now. Just because of everything I've experienced in going through that security, I can't imagine any other way that this would have, that basically people would have said, come in, boys, take over the space, right? Like that's unbelievable to me.
I think it's worth noting that the New York Times reported an hour ago that the head of the Secret Service has spent the day removing members of the Secret Service who have aligned behind Trump and only have stated that there were further plans of violence. I have not seen more than that, but I am telling you, and forgive me because I get very emotional for some of this and I just want to go off and I'm trying to control myself. I agree with Chris 100%. I have worked with Capitol Police. I lived on Capitol Hill for 10 years. And it's interesting to see the organization. We have some questions that are starting to come in. One that I was asked in my private email is that how has social media played a role in this, and what is social media doing now to address Mr. Trump or President Trump and other members of leadership, both in the House and Senate, and what they are talking about? Deepa, would you like to go first?
Sorry, I was reading some questions in the chat, so I did not. I'm sorry, I didn't pay attention to what you just said.
That's okay. We're talking about social media. Chris, you want to jump?
I could jump in a little bit, yeah.
Okay.
I mean, I think with social media, right? We're seeing kind of in a way a similar reality as the Republican Party is dealing with. They're having to deal with the beast of their own creation. They're having to deal with the reality that they have fomented for in the Republican Party sense for about 40 years, and in social media for the last 2 decades of multi-billion-dollar profits. Facebook and I guess Zuckerberg with Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. This is the least that you could do. Literally, for them, this is the least that you could do. At this point, I think it's a very well understood reality that they will drag their feet to ensure that they maintain profits over safety of human beings. That's pretty clear. They have carved out a mythical space that somehow they are a space of First Amendment protection, where that has really never been clearly explained in a legal sense. You can, private corporations have the ability to deal with a lot of different aspects of speech that you would think that they could do the same way. Their policies are very erratically enforced. There's a reckoning for them, and they know that this is a moment that if they did not act, they were going to lose money, and so they acted. Now, what happens in the next few months, I think, will be interesting, and how Congress decides to regulate them too will be interesting, because something will happen from this point on. There's not going to be nothing happening, right? Something will take place.
Yeah, I totally agree. For those who are not familiar, one of the statistics I share in my American government classes are that according to Pew Research and Rasmussen Reports, which are two of the top polling firms in the US, 62% of Americans now get 100% of their political news from social media. It is a new way that the president has his fireside chat or direct linkage to the voters. And we have seen it used well and seen it used badly. What is shocking is that the first president to utilize it was Barack Obama, and that wasn't that long ago. So we're dealing with a lot of changes that are really, really new. Mark Zuckerberg issued a press release a little while ago that stated that they would not allow Trump back online on Facebook for at least 2 weeks to help ensure a safe transition. Twitter has put together a list of items for the Trump administration to follow. Word out of the White House, according to NPR and the AP Wire, is that he plans to just use one of his staffers' Twitter accounts. Whether or not that actually comes to fruition or not is hard to tell. Deepa, did you want to add anything?
Yeah, I mean, so I think if we think about, Donald Trump as a 3-year-old person, when he started his life, the informational landscape was totally different from what it is today. In 73 years, right? We went from a society where not everybody had a television at home. You know, that changed in the 50s, with people just having access to a few channels. And by the 90s, right, one of the things that happened, a lot of things happened in the 90s. One of the things that happened in the 90s was suddenly you had a proliferation, an explosion of TV networks, right? And Donald Trump rode that wave. And he first started his kind of post building career as a reality TV star, and then really became I mean, that's how he developed a following, and then he's moved that following online. And so in a very short period of time, in sort of a blip of history, we've watched the media landscape completely change, and our government has been incapable or unwilling to really keep up with that change and regulate it, right? So we haven't seen the level of regulation that some other societies that are more authoritarian have actually used, but we are also suffering some of the consequences. And I think that, you know, we're living in this moment where a lot of aspects of the digital revolution are becoming really clear to us. And I think that as a society, you know, and I'm someone who believes that government is a tool that can be used for both good and evil. And I think that we have to, you know, we have how government can be used as a tool to regulate, and that sometimes regulation is important. A lot of Americans don't like regulation, right? But I think we're seeing how we need some regulation in order to have safety.
I agree, but that does tend to be a more liberal viewpoint for sure, Deepa. And I will actually note that some of the senators said yesterday that we can count on them holding hearings about how to move forward with social media. Just 10 years ago, the head of the technology committee, if you haven't seen it, you can go on YouTube, was like, I don't understand those series of tubes. And it became a
Yeah.
section that was put into a dance track. And they've come a long way since then, which is good. I would
So,
like,
I was just
oh,
going to say,
sorry.
Jill, real quick,
Mhm.
that yesterday was such a clear manifestation of that dividing line, right? A movement that was basically organized through social media, the internet, QAnon, all of that stuff, met up with a structure of power that was literally moving mahogany suitcases full of like 1800 size papers. And really, like, one of the big fears yesterday was what would happen if they didn't take those mahogany suitcases, because though we know what the electoral votes were, if they weren't officially counted, then the president isn't certified. That's how kind of, you know, different technology we're dealing with here, and they have to address those realities, right?
I agree.
Yeah, sorry, I
Um,
interrupted.
oh, no, it's good. I want to bring up another point that I think is very easy, and it's come up in our chat too, or very important rather, and not easy, but very complex. And that is because of the differences in analytics and the information we're fed on all these social media feeds, we're seeing two different versions of America. They are the rhetoric from the right and the rhetoric from the left, and they are not the same. They are shockingly different. For teaching, I keep a dummy account that is liberally oriented and one that is conservative. Several conservative news sources, such as Breitbart, are reporting that the incident yesterday was actually organized by QAnon. There are others that are saying it was organized by Antifa. And what I really think is important to understand here is we live in this very liberal bubble, but we are not the only people. We do have conservative students. I have gotten quite a few emails that, and we have people in the United States who truly believe that the election, despite evidence to the contrary and 60 defeats in court, was stolen. And this is part of why the uprising happened. It becomes very important for us to look beyond the headlines that we see on social media and look deeper. And if you're ever unsure if a source is legitimate or not, mediabiasfactcheck.com is an aggregate site that is really good at telling what the bias is. Someone has asked Pete and a few others about how is the president removed via the 25th Amendment to the Constitution? Chris, do you want to start us off on that?
Sure. I had to kind of start looking it up a little bit more to get the specifics.
Yeah.
I honestly didn't. I mean, I just knew it was there, right? I didn't really know the way it goes. But apparently, the way the process has to happen is a letter has to be kind of drafted up by the vice president, signed on by half of the cabinet, and then it's actually sent to the president. And the president then either agrees that they are no longer competent to perform their duties or disagrees. If they disagree, then the letter goes back to the vice president and they can take it to Congress, whereas Congress has about 21, I think it's 21 days, up to 21 days to decide one way or the other. Now, the interesting thing is that at the moment that that letter is returned from the president and goes to Congress, because it is an uncertain situation, the president is kind of sidelined. They are taken away of all of their powers. Those powers are given to the vice president until Congress decides one way or the other. If they decide in favor of the president, they go back to the president. If they decide in favor of the vice president then assumes the presidency. It's a slow process. It's not very quick, but there is sort of a push that I think could be very legitimate of starting the process, even though its fruition wouldn't happen by the end of the term, right? To actually start having some sort of consequences for actions. And I mean, that's kind of where it's at. It's being asked by Congress members, some senators as well. I haven't seen yet if anybody from the Republican side in the Senate has added on. I know in the House, a few people have.
Yeah, Teresa
So yeah.
Teresa LaRue shared a link to the members that have signed
Oh,
on so
perfect.
far in the chat. Thank
Yeah.
you.
So, I mean, it's a process that can be called for from the Congress, but it's not within the congressional or the legislative branch. This is an executive branch situation that would need to be started by Vice President Pence. And
Yes.
then the cabinet kind of has to sign on, which in itself is creating an interesting situation because we just had a cabinet member announce that they're resigning, the Secretary of Transportation. And so I don't really know what that means. If people start resigning, then is it less numbers? Do they have to be nominated cabinet members? Do they could it be acting? This is where I'm not exactly sure how this all falls down, really.
Yeah, and then there's the issue of time. Technically, Biden will be sworn in on January 20th. So is there even time to do anything? If there were another impeachment, there would have to be another trial where he would be able to defend himself. So that's a little bit unclear. There are also some tweets that came out yesterday criticizing the vice president. And those tweets were made by by President Trump, arguing that he wasn't standing up for him enough and the falsities that have happened with the election. Deepa, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm just seeing in the chat, I think Jim Jewell asked if there is a difference between the 25th Amendment and the impeachment process in terms of future runs for that president. So I think that the 25th Amendment, I mean, technically it doesn't disallow future runs, right? So
No.
really, I mean, the history of the 25th Amendment, it came out of Kennedy's assassination. And so in the months after that, there was this, it was initiated to say, like, look, we don't really have a process for how the vice president assumes the presidency, right? And so as Cristobal mentioned, it's something that it's the 25th Amendment really takes place within the executive branch, whereas the impeachment process is something that involves it's with the legislative, and it would disallow him from running again, or disallow a president from running again. But yeah, the question is, what about the time factor? I don't know that there is enough time and agreement.
Mhm. Yes, though quite a few Republicans said that the actions yesterday were not okay and not democratic. They still refuse to condemn Mr. Trump for not indemnifying the actions or stopping it at the beginning when he probably could have. and then also saying, I love you at the end of his statement yesterday to those who stood up for him. Language is very powerful and very influential. There are some people who have typed in the chat that they feel that the Democrats have treated Mr. Trump and his followers more as a joke than taking seriously their impact, and that the far right and fascism is on the rise. That's true internationally. We've seen it in election results. The issue of the masses banding together is one that has been brought up, and one that we at the college are very aware of too. On February 4th, Nikita Oliver will be coming to campus, and we'll be focusing the rest of the year on how to make changes at the state and local levels. So you can bring in issues that directly affect you and ask how to deal with it. We want to be that for you. Whether or not Trump has been taken lightly enough is something that's hard to gauge, and it may take time for us looking back at history to fully understand the overall impact of all that we have seen in the past 4 years. I can tell you that with the Democrats in charge of the Senate, the House, and the White House, I bet we're going to see legislation that will be written down about what behaviors are allowed and which are not in the White House, and it will go quite beyond what the norms of the subculture of politics allow. Chris, do you have any input?
Well, I mean, I think one thing that we have experienced in these last 4 years is that really, if as a nation, the United States continues to have a government that could be pretty much governed for a minority of its population with a specific divided view of the world, then issues like this are going to continue to happen. I mean, it's just like what would make us think that this wouldn't happen again if nothing is changed? Right, like what would happen? I mean, that's one of the points about the accountability. If there is no accountability for what happened yesterday, why won't this happen again? Right, like things have to be put in action that would make change to ensure that there's more stability. I mean, one of the things that's amazing to me is that for many of the Republican representatives in the Senate and in the House that then decided, okay, the objections are just too much, what happened today is what really, this was the moment. It was the moment when your life was in threat. It wasn't the 3,000 people that have been dying daily because of incompetence at the federal government. No, it wasn't that. It wasn't all of the other things that have happened in the last 4 years. None of that really mattered to them. It was the moment that there were literally mobs at their doors, knocking down and breaking glass, that they were like, oh, maybe this went too far. It was that moment. And so if that's the reality that the government is going to rule itself under, then the only way to cause change is to have mobs at the door doing things. So Congress has to address it. They have to address it. They have to somehow put in some parameters for what's behavior that the president can do and what is not. And more importantly, then, what will happen when it is not done? Because we always thought, and I'm a historian, I've taught the Constitution as there's an impeachment process that can stop a president who is doing acts that are, and all of that stuff. That didn't happen. Didn't happen at all. On top of monuments of evidence that could have addressed this, it didn't happen. So yeah, there's going to be a lot of soul searching in Congress specifically to figure out why have they become so feckless in their power, and why have they become such rollover aspects to the executive. That has to be addressed.
What I would totally add to that is I think you need to take a look at the two parties. We have a weak two-party system here in the US. So third parties do exist, but they have a hard time winning an election because of tradition and balloting laws and this sort of dichotomous tradition that we have. However, what we're seeing are two parties that are de-aligned, and they're well past overdue historically for realignment. The Democrats are comprised of progressives and neoliberals, and the progressives are not welcomed by all that are in the traditional power setting. I'm talking about the Speaker of the House, and specifically has spoken out against AOC, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They need to, personally, I'd love to see Stacey Abrams put in charge of the Democratic Party. The Republican National Committee and the Republican Party, we see the split between those who have realigned behind Mr. Trump above all else, including processes, because we have seen that multiple times with the Senate Majority Leader ignoring legislation and saying he doesn't care what the people want. And the Republicans who are more vocally saying they don't know where they fit in the party and need more intersectionality to be able to continue as a party. Deepa, do you have any thoughts about the parties?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. In addition to the soul searching that's going to have to happen within the legislative branch, right? To see, like, I mean, to consider how they enabled this sort of executive power to become, so I mean, I would argue almost dictatorial, right? And this is a long process. I mean, this is like Donald Trump is again riding a wave. We've watched presidential power grow exponentially, I would say, especially in this century, right? I think with Bush's presidency and going on into Obama's presidency, and Trump is just sort of picking up on that. But I think that the Republican Party is also going to be engaging in a lot of soul searching. The gatekeeping, I would argue, it's not just the past 4 years. It started in 2015. Really, how did they allow? And you could even argue it went back to the enabling of the Tea Party starting in 2008. How did they? I mean, they made a bargain with this group of people, with this populist leader, allowing this strand to enter their party, right? That was a calculation they made, I think, because they felt that this was, I mean, to some degree, they're desperate for voters. They're desperate for blocks of voters. They know that the future is multiracial. The future is younger. They're losing that demographic. And so rather than doing the hard work of building to figure out how we appeal, how we transform American conservatism, I don't know that it can be, but how we transform American conservatism to appeal to the next generation, to appeal to multiracial voters, they went for this kind of low-hanging fruit, and this is what we've ended up with. And so I don't know, I wonder, how many of them will kind of turn inward to see how they regrow post-Trump, or if they continue to ride this Trump wagon. I don't know.
Yeah, and I would even push that clock a little bit even further back, where Deepa has placed it. I think it's very accurate for what we've seen in this sort of development of the more recent kind of fervor that really originates with that Tea Party kind of movement of, kind of orchestrating these spaces of protest that are really orchestrated sometimes even at the party level and so on, to make it seem like ground level things. But I would say that for the Republican Party, their soul searching has to start in the moment that they went from being a conservative party to being an anti-government party, right? And that goes back to the 80s. That goes back
Reagan.
to Reagan, Norbert Gorquist, the idea that you strangled the government to death by cutting taxes, cutting taxes, cutting taxes as a way to somehow regulate government power is an anti-government position. It's not a governing position. It's basically saying let's destroy the structures that exist so that we can have free liberty to do what we want to do. Well, then, yeah, there's a name to that. And it's an anti-government reality. It's not governing. And so when a party has injected itself into an ideology that's really about stopping government, then it doesn't really have much room within that government. Eventually, that will come to its head. And I think we're seeing the moment of that coming to its head. And some Republicans, like Mitt Romney, realizing that, realizing that they have gone too far in that direction. Now, how do you move away from that? I'm not sure, because this Trump movement has no ideological connection. It's not a political ideology. It's a cult of personality. There's really no conservatism attached to it. There's no fiscal conservatism attached to it. You could say there could be some religious conservatism attached to it, but it doesn't hold much either. It's just there. And in that, what this party will do, I don't know, because that dies with the leader, right? As a Latin Americanist, I studied Peron, I studied Guerin in other places. I've studied populist leaders. Those movements end up being less viable once that leader is no longer there. And not in the sense of not in power, but once they die, people die, he will die. Once he dies, people will still define themselves as Trumpistas or, Peronistas or whatever it is, but it has to have some ideological connection somewhere for it to create a party that can have long lasting effects. And I don't know where that comes for the Republican Party.
Well, and the thing about Trump, though, that's interesting, and to put it in the context of, I think the Latin American cult of personality, he does have children who are interested in taking over, right? And so I don't know that it's just going to die with him. And if we think about, his personal history, that he inherited his business from his father, that this is a dynasty, right? And we have seen a bit of dynastic politics in the US, and it's not just the Republicans. I mean, the Democratic Party, Hillary Clinton was to some degree mobilizing a dynastic vision of politics, right? So I feel like there is a real danger for that kind of dynastic politics to take root and to really grow in the next decade or so.
I think something that's interesting too to note is that we're the only major democracy with a winner-take-all system that perpetuates the two-party system, and that there have been some individual states who are trying ranked choice voting. And Arizona has said they're considering doing it too, which could perhaps open up a shift in parties in the country. I think we also need to not just infer, but say that everything that everyone on this call, and we've had over 120 moments, are feeling is legitimate and is stressful. And you can't unring the bell that was rung yesterday. We cannot ignore what happened. And I'm going to actually say that one of the biggest failings of the Democratic Party to me is that they're still playing by the rules from the 80s and they have not adjusted. And the Tea Party changed the rule book, whether anybody wants to acknowledge that or not. When they said, we're not going to vote for something, we're just going to sit here until you change, the entire center of American politics shifted right and remains there. So it's going to be really tricky to get past polarization for everyone to be on the same playbook. And, there's been a couple of statements thrown in here. And I want to bring up too, that the number one job for a politician is to get elected. That's it. All the other stuff is part of the job after, but they want to get elected. Every one of my classes, I ask them over and over, what is the goal of a political person? And that's to get reelected. So local and state activism by both sides is not going to decrease. And we should also note that the states such as Michigan, if you recall, this summer saw their state capital entered with people with guns as well. So this is actually not the first time that we've seen something that could fall under the guise of sedition or insurrection. Let's see, let me get to more. There's so many statements. Thank you all. Shireen Dabu shared a link to the library where you can find more information. Shireen, could you put it in the chat again too, please? I don't want it to get fully lost. Let me look for some more questions. What happened yesterday was not civil disobedience, but civil disobedience still works. And someone shared some research on that. I would disagree a little bit with Chris on one thing. I'd like to talk about the role of, I talk about politics all the time, but let's talk a minute about religion and politics and just break all rules for a nice conversation. The Christian Coalition has very much aligned with the Republican Party and evangelical networks. I am related to people who are in the evangelical community, have been very supportive of Mr. Trump. Chris, what do you think of some of his relationships? He has his own religious committee that talks to him. It advises him.
Yeah, I mean, so I think all right, two things. The first one is that I think we tend to do the mistake of associating religious backing with the Christian Coalition. The Christian Coalition is a political arm of the Republican Party, always has been. It's what it is, right? Uh, from its inception. And so I'm really interested in what Warnock's election in Georgia is going to do to people who vote on religious values, like actual religious values, because Warnock comes from that tradition, a different tradition, but he's steeped in religion, right? And so, Loeffler's, who was running up against him, or who was running against him in the Senate election in Georgia, one of the biggest mistakes she did was attack his religion. It looked bad. It looked really, really bad. She was basically saying, my religion is the true one, yours is the wrong one. And anybody who is actually a religious person will tell you that that shuts them down at that moment, right? Like that's not what they do with their religion. And so I think that a lot of the veil of the moral high ground that the Christian Coalition has wrapped itself in the last 40 years is slowly being stripped away. First, because some of their leadership is kind of showing some moral depravity themselves. And second, because there are a lot of people that are not conservative who are religious, right? And you can't just keep ignoring them, right? Like that's not going to work. So I think that even though those blocks are definitely there specifically in certain areas of the country, as you're seeing this being destabilized in a place like Georgia, I mean, come on, we're talking about Georgia. Like we're having a conversation about Georgia being a purple state. Like I never thought that was going to happen in any real sense in a short term as it has. So the fact that that has happened is going to force people to really think about what this reality actually is, and if they do want to have a more religious connection to their politics, they're going to have to start looking for more effective ways of doing it than just backing the Republican horse every time. So I think that that's going to destabilize things. At least I hope, honestly.
I think my perspective is a little bit different because I grew up in the Bible Belt, where our play dates
True, I grew up in Puerto Rico, so I guess.
Yeah. I remember being invited to a play date. We didn't call it that when I was younger, and we went to a tent revival. So it's a very different experience. And I can say I spoke online at something, and the response, because there was a big evangelical group there, was, we don't have to talk to you or debate this because you're not saved. And if you're not saved, then you're saying the wrong thing anyway. And it just completely shuts down any further discussion. In the South, religion plays a much bigger role than what we see here. And the percentages that we're seeing of religious people have decreased nationwide. So that's certainly a factor too. But I think in the South in particular, we're seeing it more. Let's shift for a minute to some interesting and good news, which is that the Georgia election happened also yesterday. I know it's hard to remember so much. It was a big day. Deepa, what would you say about the election in Georgia to folks?
Well, I think that was one of the specters that was hanging over what was happening yesterday, right? If you think about the fact that, Georgia wasn't called, or it was called in the midst of this takeover of Congress, of the People's House, right? When in fact, the institutional process says that now the Senate and the House are both controlled by the Democratic Party. And I think that part of what we were seeing was a protest of the institutions and what the institutional outcome was. And this is a big deal. There is a lot of legislation that has been, and Nancy Pelosi says this a lot, there's a lot of legislation that's sitting on the desk of Mitch McConnell that has been sitting there for years that Republicans in the Senate are refused to pass, right? And now I wonder, I can anticipate in the few months after these new senators are sworn in, a flurry of legislation that might feel that is just going to be basic. It's just about and I'm hoping that we're going to see some of that pass in the next few months.
I agree. And the elections brought us some firsts from Georgia too. And we saw our first African American Senate member elected there. We've seen a lot of firsts. We have our first African American vice president about to be sworn in too. And we will have a transition of power. Mitch McConnell has blocked over 150 pieces of legislation that the House has passed over the past couple of years, has said he does not care in press conferences. So you can look that up and see it. And didn't even just block it, he wouldn't even allow it to be considered or discussed. Chuck Schumer, who is the leader of the Democrats, has spoken against them and said yesterday that he is not even on speaking terms with the Republican leadership right now, which I think is not a particularly great sign. People are asking why there is so much polarization now. I think we can look first at social media. When we click on something, analytics programs tell them what we've clicked on because they want us to keep clicking. It feeds us into what they think we want to see. And so it limits the perspective we're getting, which is why I have those two accounts that I mentioned before. Chris, do you have any input?
Sure. I mean, I think that social media in some ways has exacerbated some realities that we as a nation have been experiencing, probably for about 40 or 50 years, maybe even 60 years. And that is really a changing demographic, right? The changing demographics of the United States, talking about legislation being important, really start accelerating in the 1960s when the Johnson administration gets rid of the quota system that privileged white immigrants from Europe coming into the country and becoming citizens, right? And so as that changes, what you're seeing is changing demographics throughout the nation and reactions to that. And so we've seen that kind of move itself through many different places. In the 80s, you had backlash and really contentious sort of politics in Florida that was really along the lines of divisions of changing demographics. That shifts to California in the 90s, and you see it in Arizona and Georgia. Part of the reasoning that a lot of people think that Georgia has changed so much is in part because of the push by the leadership in that state to try to suppress the people who are no longer of their background from being active in politics, right? And so that reality to do that, and so the reason I ethics is a big thing is that to be able to mobilize people against people who are coming in, you have to do quite a bit of work of disinformation. You have to do quite a bit of work of creating false narratives, leaning into stereotypes, leaning into, to be honest, hatred, right? And so the process that we have seen in this country in the last 60 years is as demographics are changing in a place, you start seeing a desire by certain structures of power that do not want to give up power, and certain people that do not want to give up power use demagoguery to try to retain power. And that leads to having to create a whole different structure of communication, a whole different narrative that is completely devoid of the narrative that the new sort of realities in the society are actually engaging with. Social media just allowed that to become so much easier to do, right? The internet has
Mhm.
allowed that to be so much easier to do, but it's a long-term problem for this nation. And really, it's we had a racial reckoning and an uprising around Black Lives Matter movement and against policing, in part because of the same reality, right? Like policing is another structure that does not want to change, even though it needs to change. Our politics are a structure that need to start thinking of itself in a much more multi-racial sort of way and does not want to do it, right? You look at that, at especially the Senate, that does not reflect the United States. I mean, it does not
It's way
reflect the
better
United
than it
States.
used to be.
Right, and it's a lot better. And
Yeah.
and so that reality is being forced to change, and we're seeing a entrenchment of different groups to there. And so I think that that's part of the reason for this, and it's much deeper than just Facebook or Twitter or the internet, right?
Thank you. Larry Kushney, are you still on? I'd like to hear from you too. Awesome.
I
All
do
right.
continue to exist. Um,
Thank you.
I think most of my thoughts were in a lot of my own work and research, specifically about revolutionary radical protest groups and movements in the United States and its long-running past, and specifically ones that utilize property destruction. And so much of the conversation during the protests during the summer were focused on many of those elements that outsiders who may not have engaged with larger struggles for justice for Black lives saw protesters and of course, saw the unruliness rather than what were overwhelmingly kind of peaceful protests. And I think that that also created this space of justification for what we witnessed yesterday on the right, which was there was a counter they could offer to what was going on. The whataboutism that we see in political discourse had a really clear corollary in that space. But what I've been spending a lot more time thinking about is the continuing rise of right-wing insurgency and violence in the United States, and that what you saw yesterday, I think Chris was on point when he talked about how it was an insurrection. It was just kind of a not really well done one, but it doesn't mean it wasn't being previously organized. I mean, there's all you had to do was get on Parler or write Twitter, and this has been organized over the last month. With January 6th as that date, with very specific ideas of going to the Capitol and breaking in and stopping what was going on. And the fact that DC police had access to all of this information and decided not to act on it, I think is also telling. But what I also worry about is that what we tend to see is that under Democratic presidential administrations, we see a rise in right-wing violence as a direct response to that. And I think that now we have a coordination across, whether it be, certain organizations that kind of put themselves at the front of these protests, whether we talk about various conspiracy theories or just the fact of, long-term running white nationalists and white power groups have been organizing the United States for a long time, that, it's going to be kind of coming to a head. And this is going to be a space that, because there isn't an executive in office that they see as representing some form of their values, then they're going to act out in other ways. And so that's what I'm really worried about, is this as a moment that kind of provides cohesive opportunity to move forward for many of these groups and for people to find a route into these realms if they've been thinking about it, even in casual terms.
Thank you, Larry. Deepa, would you like to add anything?
Well, one thing that I thought, that I thought about yesterday, right? I wondered how much Trump and the right-wing protesters were anticipating a left-wing presence that wasn't there, right? And that they were hoping that that meeting would generate a certain level of chaos that would enable calling, let's say, like the National Guard or dispatching more military force to counter the left protests, right? The fact that it was a right-wing protest, that it was dominated by right-wing protesters, right? And that we didn't see the kind of military response that we had been seeing over the summer to left-wing protests does make me worry about this future that I think is absolutely possible, that Larry's talking about, that when we have a democratic, we're going to have a democratic government. It won't just be the presidency. It will be the legislature as well, right? And the fact that I think a lot of right wing, not just protesters, but militias are going to feel that they need to act outside of the law, outside of the institutional framework to sort of defend themselves, to defend their values. I think that's something that we should be deeply worried about. And are our police departments going to protect us, right, from this violence? What we saw yesterday, the answer is no.
Yeah, I really want to point out too, once again, that DC actually requested that there be troops in place the day before yesterday, and they were ignored. So there's definitely some discussion that needs to happen. There are so many comments that are happening right now. I'm going to wrap Jim Jewell into our conversation too. He is English faculty, but also one of the founders of the Civic Engagement Committee. I'm hoping that we can talk about, as we start to wrap up in the next 20 minutes, what are some things we can do to affect ourselves here locally and in the state, because let us not forget that the governor's office was also occupied yesterday too. And we have a diverse culture that where the majority of people here are liberal, but it's not everyone. And how do you find middle ground? Are you trying to find middle ground, and what can you do? Jim has been very active in several ways. Jim, would you like to add something?
Yeah, I wanted to talk about a word that has popped up a bunch of times in the conversation, which is narrative. While this was unfolding yesterday, I had the chance to come into campus and actually work with a student. And the student's question, we were working on something different, but the question about what was happening was, why? Why are people doing this? And I said, because they live inside a narrative that has been constructed for them and that they will defend, that has become a fact. And we don't share narratives anymore. And it's definitely amplified by social media, but it did start, for me, it started in the media sphere with cable. As we started to fragment our shared stories, a fragment away from shared stories, we were able to build narratives that gave us one view of the world. And narratives are very resistant to argument. They're different. Like, narratives become a fact. They become unassailable by argument. So if there's a way forward, it's actually recognizing that we need to tell stories together. And it doesn't mean you need to reach all the way across the aisle to those very fine people that are marching with tiki torches, but it does mean that you need to find people who differ from you in some way and start to build stories with them. You need to share your story in ways that is open to being changed. You need to be willing to build a civic shared story within your city. It doesn't require compromise, but does require openness. Openness in a way that I think we're all hurting so much. It's hard to do, and it's hard to do because we're physically separated as well. The power of narrative is something that every time I think that I am overblowing it, the world shows me, no, I'm really not. It's what drives us, is story. So we have to take control of it.
Thank you, Jim. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you. Chris?
Yeah, I think building off of what Jim was saying, I think there's two things that are necessary for you to really start being able to engage with narratives and with your own narrative in a much more effective way. One of the first things is that openness that Jim is talking about, but closely to that is kind of understanding what your core is, right? Like, what are your values? What are the things that when you are going to sit down to think about reaching to people who view differently than you, what are those spaces that you're like, yeah, that's a different value to me, and that's a space that I cannot inhabit, right? Because often what we're left with is not realizing that until the hurt is so bad, the pain is so deep, that we react, and we do not think. And it's just reactionary, reactionary, reactionary. And at those moments, I mean, we've all encountered it. I've encountered it on Facebook's back and forth and everything devolves, right? And we end up with really scenarios like what we saw yesterday, where there is a narrative of just everything within the bubble that you inhabit is good, everything outside of it is bad and evil and must be attacked, right? And we know that that binary is not real. It's just not real. It's not a real thing. So I would say that that's a space that we need to really start doing that internal search of what our cores, what our values are. And then I would also say we need to start pushing on those spaces and those areas that we know within our own communities and within our own identities are problematic. One of the things that is my going sort of goal for this year is to really start engaging with white Latino male racists. They are leading a lot of these movements. White Latino male racists, one of them is the head of the Proud Boys, right? Like this is an actual reality that our Latinx community has kind of tried to shield itself as it's not true. And anybody who's in the Latinx community knows that it is a well deep-seated belief that somehow because people are Latinos, they can't be racist. And we know that that's not true. And we need to engage that head on. We need to break that narrative down. We need to expose that for what it is. And I think that that's something that is a call to action for a lot of my Latinx community folk. We need to do that work. We can't let that continue to slide because part of what happened yesterday is on our community and we need to address that.
I would also like to add that I've worked at the federal level on government issues and I've worked at the state level, and we can really affect change and see it more immediately at the state and local levels. And one of the reasons the Civic Engagement Committee wants to focus on the state and local levels is so that we can address some of these issues. And we are planning events for you so that people who are activists like Nikita Oliver, who ran for mayor and has created their own interest group, can share some of the ways that they're doing it. We have a great community here and we're very lucky to have the freedom to be able to do this. Let me ask Deepa if she'd like to share some of the ways she's affecting change too.
Well, I think like at these moments of sort of national drama and like, I mean, we're witnessing a big transition for our federal government, right? So we think like, I mean, we might feel despair about how much our federal government can do, and that, our whole American democracy, our American identity feels like, fraught. And I feel, for myself, like, I mean, this is an old government, and it was not created for people like me. It was not created for people like a lot of folks who are here in this space. And I don't know that it will be able to accommodate us and our stories, right? We are witnessing whether or not it can. At the same time, I know that like my city and that my college campus and my students, the spaces that we move in daily might be more capable of accommodating certain things. And I think it's important to put energy in those spaces and to continue to act and continue to challenge those frameworks that were never meant for us. But at the same time, there's so much that we can do locally and in our smaller spaces to affect change. Seattle, our city council just defunded our police department by 20%, which is the most that any police department has been defunded across the country. And by defunding, it's not to say like, we want to, like, the police are that it's all this negative action. It's also about taking that money and investing it in other things like education and social services and things where we know we have people who are doing work to support community members. And so I think that that's another thing that gives me hope, is that there's a lot of change that's happening on the local level, and the national level, that works at a scale that, we can wait for, but we also have to do things locally.
Larry, can you share how elected officials come to South every spring?
You mean through me bullying them?
Yeah.
Yeah. So what I tried to set up when I first got the gig at South was I had some established relationships with legislators in our district, but as South is, I think, the largest employer in their district as well, and as the largest educational institution in their district, I thought it was incumbent upon them to kind of report out to us at the end of each session. And so what I've set up is this kind of regular communication stream where usually in January, if we were in human meat body times, I'd take my students there and we would talk with them and lobby them on issues that impact community college students. And then they would come and report to us. They would come and visit us at South and kind of talk about what their legislative priorities were for the year, what they've done on behalf of our students, and then have open Q&A sessions for them to engage with students and have students have a chance to ask some questions. And we're lucky in our district that 2 of our 3 reps at Olympia are really open to that and come and participate and seem to enjoy doing it. And I'd highly recommend that each of our 3 institutions do something similar, and it just opens up a long-term relationship with them when concerns come up for us to be able to re-engage.
Thank you, Larry. I appreciate it. I just want to let everyone know, first, Annie, yes, you can share that from your note. I want to note that we are aware of the need that is here and are hearing the exhaustion from some people, but also hearing that people are riled up and want some guidance for what to do. We are working on putting together a webpage for the northseattle.edu site that focuses on civic engagement. It will have a tilted example of how to write an effective letter to a member of the state legislature and the federal legislature. We will also have links to all of the events that will help teach people what to do. And we'll address what's effective and what's really not effective too, because your energy and your time is valuable, and we recognize that, and we want you to have the most effective time doing so that you can. Let me throw this to Chris blindly as I try to get in a couple more of questions. And sorry, Chris Duvall, but that's happening. It's up to you now. Hold on, I'm going to go check the questions for just a moment.
No worries. So, I mean, I think one of the ongoing discussions I've had throughout my entire career teaching with students is this idea that they are powerless with our political structures. And I have to remind them they definitely are if they think they are, right? Like if you think you're powerless, you're going to totally be powerless. There's no way for you to be in any way engaging with any power structure. And invariably, if they do reach out, if they do go to forums, if they do go to these spaces, they realize that they're dealing with an actual human being. It may not get what they want, but they're getting a better understanding of how things work. And once you kind of start understanding navigation of these systems, how you can inject aspects that could change, you can actually really develop power that can be used, that can be useful, and that can be useful to better your own world, right, and your own community. But if you start with powerlessness, you're going to stay powerless, right? Did I eat up enough time, Jill?
Yes, that's good. Jim, I'm going to throw it to Jim for a minute so he can remind us what Eric Lutz said.
What Eric Liu said on which point?
In terms of being active citizens.
Oh yeah, that power, I like the fact that Chris was talking about, unused power. Power is something that you use because you should, because it's meant to be used, and it goes away if you don't. And we have more of it when we bind ourselves together. Power is not something we have to go and get from somewhere else. It's something we already have and can build with other people. And if you start to imagine power as infinite in that way, it's just something you can create out of thin air by finding like-minded people and working towards something, suddenly nothing is unattainable, because it's not that you have to get power from some different source. You are the actual source. The one way to look at it in the opposite is, you aren't the traffic, you aren't stuck in traffic, you are the traffic, which means we're not stuck in a problem. We are the problem, and we can solve the problem.
And Deepa, do you have anything you'd like to say before I wrap it up?
Yeah, I mean, I want to go back to Jim's point about narratives. And I think that, narrative is another way to think about power and to think about sort of a big giant web of power. And we live in a world where we're trapped in a web of multiple narratives, and every day you're coming into contact with different narratives about how power operates. Does COVID exist? Will the vaccine work? Was the election stolen? And you have the opportunity to, it's oftentimes, we want to tune all these narratives out, and I'm not saying you should engage everyone, but engaging a couple of them every day, right? And resisting them and saying, actually, no. And the person-to-person encounter is so much more powerful than anything that's coming from an anonymous source, right? You can stop that narrative. You can redirect that energy, right? You have that power. We have that power. You can do it online. You can do it in a classroom setting. You can do it when you're hanging out, when you're in a group chat, right? I also linked to the Seattle Collegian in the chat here. So the Seattle Collegian is the Seattle College's news site, and they take contributions from faculty, they take contributions from students. I would strongly recommend, if you're interested in influencing, moving the narrative in a particular direction, right? This is a place, make a contribution, contribute an op-ed, right? It's an awesome space to shape the story.
The Seattle Times accepts from everyone too. In fact, a 12-year-old participant to our Eric Liu event printed his views in an op-ed piece in the Seattle Times a couple weeks after we had that event. Larry, would you like to say anything as we start to wrap up?
Thanks for including me in discussion. I look forward to the event coming up on Wednesday, as well as the event with Nikita Oliver. They're a great speaker in this space, so I'm excited for that as well. I don't have too much I want to add. The focus for me going forward is really about what this means in my classroom. I am in the 4th day of a quarter trying to build trust with students in an online environment, and then to jump and dive into this, I think we all really need to be reticent and thoughtful about how we engage, because we can't let it slip by. So then what is that kind of next step? So I'm spending a lot of time today thinking about how I'm going to roll out some new material tomorrow, or on Monday, I guess. So thanks for your time. I appreciate it. And thanks for putting this together.
I would like to bring up, thank you, Larry, that there are quite a few students who want us to address that these things happened and acknowledge that they have these big, real feelings of stress that are happening. Not only are our lives upended because of COVID, but because of this violence too. I would like to give a shout out to Carolyn Pugh, who's faculty development coordinator. I have participated in a lot of trauma influenced pedagogy techniques that she has been nice enough to bring experts to campus for, and they have helped me immensely in the classroom. So I really recommend those for other faculty members. We are also here as the Civic Engagement Committee to be a resource. I want to note that we were 120 strong, and we're stronger together. We are very fortunate to have an amazing community. This is my 15th year anniversary here. I never thought I'd ever work at one place this long, but we have an amazing community. If you have questions, you can email any of us. I want to thank Chris, Deepa, Jim and Larry for participating along with me and for having support from our administration as well. Keep an eye out. We'll send out an announcement for next Wednesday's event. It will be open to all 3 campuses and our Seattle neighbors. And February 4th, same time, 12 o'clock, we will have Nikita Oliver here to speak and answer your questions. Thank you, everyone. Take good care of yourselves. Be kind to yourselves. Take breaks, dance, listen to music, do whatever makes you happy. Thank you so much. Take care. Goodbye. Take care.